We've got a special relationship with Great Britain.
The special relationship.
The special relationship.
The special relationship.
That the relationship between our two nations is unlike any other.
Whether you like the term special relationship or not, it is the UK's single most important bilateral relationship.
Our special relationship is truly special. They are our most important ally in the world.
You were the first woman to be the UK ambassador to the United States. Did you always want to be an ambassador when you were younger?
It was the first thing I wanted to be. I then toyed with being a fighter pilot.
There were many, many strong female ambassadors when I was ambassador to France. Just in my own embassy, many of our top people were women. What was interesting to me was I saw all of that in sort of the public and in the diplomatic corps. On the private sector side, France, I think, is probably even worse than we are. But this is something Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, has been talking about, pause and pauses, because we've made it very clear that we care deeply about, one, humanitarian aid getting in, two, the release of the hostages, and three, Israel obviously has a right to defend itself.
I think the pause will be of most use for getting humanitarian supplies in and letting civilians leave of their own accord, those people who want to, and we've managed to get some British civilians out. I think for the hostages, Hamas ought to release them unconditionally.
Hi everybody, it's an incredible privilege to be sitting here now with these two remarkable power women. On far end here, British Ambassador to the US, Dame Karen Pierce. In her 4-decade diplomatic career, she's worked closely on the response to the 9/11 attacks and the peace process to end the Bosnian War. She's served as the British Ambassador to Afghanistan and as the permanent representative to the UK mission to the United Nations. And she's a good friend. And ditto Jane Hartley, who had a stellar career as founder and CEO of a global advisory firm before being appointed by President Obama as US Ambassador to France, and then tapped by President Biden as the US Ambassador to the Court of St. James, an incredible diplomatic twofer. So welcome to you both. So Dame Karen, just yesterday, big news, right? Gobsmacking news, as a matter of fact, because former Prime Minister David Cameron, now Lord Cameron, suddenly steps out of a car outside Downing Street. Everybody's astounded to hear that he's the new Foreign Secretary. So talk about it. I mean, what was in Rishi Sunak's mind, this very extraordinary new appointment?
Well, I think it's a great appointment, given all the challenges we face in the world at the moment. It's enabling the Prime Minister to have the cabinet he needs to help tackle the domestic and the international challenges. Very sorry to lose James Cleverly, who was a great friend of America, but he's needed at the Home Office, particularly on the issue of migration. David Cameron knows a huge number of world leaders. He's dealt with a lot of problems that have led to some of the challenges we see today. He dealt with ISIS, he chaired a G7, actually I think a G8 summit in 2013, on very close terms with lots of world leaders. I think it gives the Foreign Office itself an extra oomph, and I think he's going to be a great figure on the world stage in support of Rishi.
Yeah, I mean, it was actually a very sort of ballsy, if I may say, decision of the Prime Minister to bring in someone of that.
Shows confidence.
It does show a lot of confidence, although, of course, the right wing are not very happy about it because of the, well, it'll be very interesting to see how it plays out, let's put it that way. So, of course, Cameron immediately is going to be confronted by the huge Israeli-Hamas crisis. I mean, you've had such long experience in wartime diplomacy, Karen. What role do you think Britain can play in trying to sort out any sort of solution?
I think the best role Britain plays is problem solving and burden sharing. You can't solve big problems like this without US leadership. And I'd like to salute the leadership the President and Secretary Blinken have been showing. We have a deep history in the Middle East, for good and bad. We can bring that to bear. We have the relationships that David Cameron and prior to that James Cleverly had made. And we do a lot of thinking about how to solve this sort of problem. We've got a lot of experience. We have a great many experienced diplomats who've made the Middle East their career anchors. So I'm hopeful that we can work with the Americans, work with the UN, work with the region itself to try and bring some shape to this, to try and get the humanitarian aid in, get the hostages out while supporting Israel's right to defend itself within international law.
Well, Jane, as we speak, tens of thousands of people are about to march in support of Israel here in Washington. And of course, on Saturday, there were 300,000 who took to the streets in a massive sort of pro-Palestinian march. It was actually a peaceful march, but it was a very amazing turnout. For the American ambassador to be there, of a staunchly pro-Israel administration, how are you sort of navigating this? Have there been dozens of dissent cables, I know, in the channels of dissent within the Foreign Office protesting, the need, of course, for a ceasefire. I mean, for you, it must be difficult to navigate on the ground.
Yeah, it has been a difficult time. In terms of the marches, first of all, we did have, I think it was 300,000 ending up at the U.S. Embassy on Saturday. But it was peaceful. It was peaceful, and I am sure in London we will have many more. I believe in free speech, and I believe in the right to protest as long as it is peaceful and not hateful. To your second point, it's difficult. It's tough. I see the dissent cables coming out of state. And by the way, I've got to commend Tony Blinken, who sent out a note yesterday or the day before saying he understands how people feel and please keep communicating. This is difficult, though. If you think, and I feel it personally, if you think about the State Department, people go into the State Department, they go into the Foreign Service to be diplomats. They go in to be diplomats because they think diplomacy works. They go in to make sure diplomacy works to get to peace. I've served in, as you said, I served under President Obama as ambassador to France, serving under President Biden now, and I served in the White House long ago. People go into government to try to make the world a better place. So for many of the people in the State Department and many of the people in my own embassy, this is very, very difficult. Now, we can't lose sight of the fact that Israel was attacked, and we can't lose sight of the fact that this was a terrorist attack by a terrorist group. And I think both President Biden and Secretary Blinken are really trying to thread that needle. President Biden said, I think last night, that he was, I'm not sure if this is the right word, that restraint should be used, especially in terms of hospitals and to protect hospitals. I think President Biden and Tony Blinken are listening to people. Having said that, once again, if you live in Israel and you live 2 miles from that border where you have Hamas, which is a terrorist group that's pledged to destroy Israel, they have a right to defense. As Tony Blinken said, how they do it is important, and I also think, going forward, as we move to a two-state solution, how they do it is important as well.
Well, you, of course, were chairman of Sesame Street, so, there's a lot of children who are dying in Gaza.
Listen, I was with the Darren Walker, your friend, Ford Foundation, and the president of Sesame Street were over in London last week, and we were talking about what we could do in terms of philanthropically together for children. It's very hard for me. Sesame Street had a program that worked closely with refugee children, supported by a MacArthur grant in a partnership with the IRC, the first ever. This is very difficult. I do believe that Tony Blinken and President Biden are navigating this better than anybody else could, because, by the way, they see the difficulty.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, one of the things that constantly happens when you are an ambassador is that these enormous crises blow up and the other priorities get, to try to work on the proactive priorities becomes a real heavy lift because the focus is gone. So, but you've also, of course, a lot of your time has been spent on strengthening economic ties. I know, in the UK. Boris Johnson, you know, promised that the prize of Brexit was going to be a free trade agreement with the US, which evaporated. But talk about the new pact that you did manage to get signed, which is this new economic pact, the Atlantic.
Yeah, I mean, listen, President Biden has been to the UK 4 times since I've been ambassador. The UK is extremely important. The special relationship is real. And we work on challenges like Ukraine in particular, where UK has really led the way. But in June, Karen was there. The president and the prime minister had a meeting at the White House. And out of that came the Atlantic Declaration, which talked about how we can have more secure supply chains, how we can work together in terms of skilled employment, and talk about some things that we've been talking about, the two countries have been talking about in terms with USTR and others, in terms of what we do on small and medium-sized businesses. Can we make it easier for them to do business across the Atlantic on both sides? You know, we do, I just looked at this the other day, which I was surprised. I was doing a speech for BAB, British American Business. Trade is up 25% since COVID. Which I'm really somewhat surprised. And listen, we are talking constantly. I think there's a meeting in early December, which will be the second meeting, I think it's early December, of the Atlantic Declaration in terms of what we can do. Our vice president was just over in terms of the AI summit. I was in a bilat with Prime Minister Rishi, and then she had a private dinner with him and was part of the summit itself. And I give the UK government huge credit for doing that summit. I think it was well done, and that's another area we know we have to work together on it.
Well, tell me, Karen, President Xi and Biden are meeting tomorrow. When David Cameron was Prime Minister, he was very gung-ho on China UK relations. I mean, you know, he called it a golden era, I think, of China UK relations. Does Cameron now taking over as foreign minister, do you think that there will be a greater emphasis on more outreach with China through?
I think the relationships with China, both for the US and the UK, are evolving slightly as we try and make the most of the cooperate where we can strand, which both President Biden and Rishi Sunak believe in. And that's obviously on things like climate, with the COP28 summit coming up. It's on things like global health. It may be that out of the Xi-Biden meeting, we'll see cooperation on fentanyl, which is a huge problem here in the US. And we have our share of that, though we have some of the slightly different issues. But I think David Cameron was very clear yesterday when he was appointed. He said he had disagreed with Rishi Sunak in some policy areas, but also that his own views had evolved in the time since he was Prime Minister. And I think he would say the situation with China, with the Uyghurs, with what happened over COVID, that illustrates just how far away, if you like, China has moved from what you might think of as a global norm. And I think David Cameron's policies will absolutely reflect that. And I think he'll be a great support to the Prime Minister on China as well.
Well, Karen, of course, you know, you've took over, the embassy. You've been through an extraordinary time, really, because you got here in the Trump time, and then there was COVID. But talk about being the British ambassador during January the 6th. Because, I mean, what a day, right?
It was a day. Amazingly, we were having a leadership meeting. You know, embassies like to have these things like away days and leadership meeting. And it took a while for us to realise what was going on through in a completely different part of the embassy. But I think, and the Prime Minister at the time said this, to think of what was happening in the capital with all its Palladian Roman splendour. You know, it absolutely embodies Western democracy. And to think of an assault happening on that building of all buildings, and in those circumstances, I think we were worried. Not about the resilience or the power of America, just that it seemed to be not a symbol, but it seemed to be a commentary on how divisive politics had become. And we did watch very worried as the attacks took place, trying to find Speaker Pelosi as it was then. We watched very carefully what Vice President Pence was doing. We were very sorry to see the injuries and deaths that resulted from that. But at the same time, I think we all had a confidence that the American institutions would reassert themselves. And I think that's what's happening.
I mean, the other thing that really sort of struck me about your tenure was that, you are very well known for your tradecraft and your kind of social outreach, Karen. And so you took over during COVID. You couldn't be you, right? I mean, because they were in lockdown. How did you sort of penetrate the Washington networks without being able to be, this kind of very socially deaf person that everyone knows you to be?
Well, it really worried me, to be honest. How on earth do you get impact when you're new and you've been locked up for 2 weeks because of quarantine and then lockdown? And I do think diplomacy is a contact sport. And as Tina says, I'm much better if I can see people in person. So I volunteered for every Zoom event going. And you do 3 or 4 in the morning. But I was very worried. But to be absolutely honest, bilateral diplomacy is a bit of a competition.
Yeah.
You're very conscious that there are always other countries with embassies there. And I thought, oh my goodness, if a Middle East ambassador rings up or a European ambassador rings up, the administration know who they are. The think tanks know who they are. The media knows who they are. And I've arrived and nobody knows me. So as I say, I set out consciously to get on as many Zooms as possible.
And how did it work for you? I mean, did it work? I mean, this Zoom offensive, you and the Queen, right? I mean, the Queen was always on Zoom.
The Queen was just by phone. I did not do a Zoom with the Queen, but I did have a very good conversation with her. She reads all the cables, or read, I should say, all the cables that the embassy produced. And not many people know, but when she was a child, alongside being taught English constitutional history, as you'd expect, the master at Eton who taught her that was also an American history specialist. So he threw in American history into her lessons for good measure. So she had a really good understanding of America, and we had this great conversation about American politics. She asked some pretty tough questions.
How incredible. Jane, I mean, talking about the Queen, I mean, no sooner did you arrive in London when the Queen Elizabeth died, Boris Johnson was tossed out, Liz Truss was a flyby Prime Minister before being replaced by Rishi Sunak. I mean, that was like whiplash. Yeah. Talk about those days.
Yeah, I got there for Jubilee, so the Queen was still alive. Right. And actually, I presented my credentials. It was actually a very funny story. I presented my credentials to the Queen at Buckingham Palace with all the pomp and circumstance, but it was supposed to be in person. She was not feeling well, so I actually did it on Zoom.
Amazing.
But that day was very funny because...
Were you walking backwards?
Yes.
Were you walking backwards?
I had to do... But I probably shouldn't say this, but I will. It was very funny because the palace was lovely, and they wanted to make sure all the pomp and circumstance continued. So they were going to send the horse-drawn carriage to Winfield House to pick me up with my husband. But it was the hottest day in London history, so they were worried about the horses.
I mean, that's all the Brits ever worry about, is the horses. You know?
Well, so instead we got into a car that they sent, which was also lovely, that was not air-conditioned. And my husband said, they're not very worried about the people.
Well, I'm afraid that is a great defining story.
Yes.
But it was, I arrived, Boris Johnson was still Prime Minister, and I think this is ours. I'll never forget, I had, I think a friend of hers, somebody you clearly know, I had a dinner about a weekend with Mervyn King, who used to be head of the Bank of England, who's an old friend of mine. And he said, I think you're going to serve with 3 prime ministers, maybe 4. And I said, Mervyn, you're crazy. So within a short time, Boris Johnson was gone, and Liz Truss was Prime Minister for about 44 days, and Rishi Sunak, who I very much enjoy working with. But I did have, when I was leaving, I had a friend who I had worked with. I was ambassador to France under President Obama, as Tina said. So I had a friend who I'd worked with, who you all know, but I won't give the name, at the Obama White House. And when I was leaving to go to the UK, she said to me, you know, you did such a great job in France. It's just difficult times. It was a time of terrorism, Charlie Hebdo, Bataclan, Nice, and many more. She said, so I just hope you have an easier time in the UK. And she said at the end, and this is a very senior person at the Obama White House, she said at the end, if not, I'm going to think it's you. And about 2 months in, I got an email from her saying, it's you.
Fun. So Karen, I mean, both of you actually, you know, you're both, you know, there's 2 elections coming, right? Not just the American election, but the British election. So Karen, I'd like to know from you again, like, what is diplomacy like in this election year? I mean, how do you calibrate your work with an administration that's, you know, it's last year, or maybe not, maybe there's another 4 to go, while kind of surreptitiously getting to know who might be there if the current administration isn't? I mean, is there a lot of sort of double, you know, contact work going on to make sure that everything is secure, whatever happens?
Well, we share a lot, and our embassies share a lot, and we obviously help each other. So there's a mini special relationship between the 2 embassies. I think if the embassy, any embassy, is doing its job well, we have spotted the people we need to know to keep the relationship going and productive and overcome obstacles and develop new areas. We have spotted them before the election year. We start to make our number with them at all levels in the embassy, while keeping up relationships, working relationships with the current administration. And I think that applies no matter who's in, whether it's Republicans or Democrats who are actually in power and who's the challenger. Might be worth my saying for the audience that I am a career diplomat, so we are very impartial about political parties.
Mm-hmm. And of all the things that you've done, really, since you've been ambassador, what do you think, aside from, you know, fire hose, you know, putting out fires, etc., what do you feel has been the thing you've most achieved in the last few years, each of you?
Well, I hope it's not over yet. You know, I hope there's more to come. Jane mentioned the Atlantic Charter. I think we both feel that was a very good move. The AI Summit. I think the AI Summit is a great example of how you take the special relationship, and everybody knows the traditional bedrock, the defense, the security, the intelligence. What the AI Summit represented was one of those new 21st century issues, AI tech, and showing how the US and the Brits together can forge a common framework to tackle these new challenges. So I think it's actually a great example and model for how we might do some of this in future. Obviously, we've worked together in Ukraine, and I think keeping us close on Ukraine has been one of the most important things.
Quickly, Jane.
I would agree with Karen. I mean, first of all, the good news for me, I'm a political ambassador, but a political ambassador cannot, you're supposed to be nonpartisan. That's what you're a diplomat now. So I can't get involved in the campaign. My husband's very happy I can't get involved in financing any of the campaign or political corporation contributions. Listen, I think what Karen said, when I first got to the UK, one of my first meetings was with then Secretary Ben Wallace, Secretary of Defense, and how close we were on Ukraine, how much information we shared, how much we did together. And frankly, I'm going to compliment the UK again. I mean, they were first in many things in terms of one thing, sending tanks into Ukraine a little ahead of us. That was really important for us because, you know, we need, in all of this, we need an ally. And if we don't always have to go first, that's really important. And that relationship continues. There's a new Secretary of Defense, Grant Shapps. He's terrific. And that is a really important relationship for us as we go forward on Ukraine. Personally, I care about care a lot about two things. I care about women's empowerment. I just had a dinner for Tory Burch last week, and it was about how to get more small business financing to especially women. When she started her company, as successful as she was, she couldn't get financing. And then the other thing is Northern Ireland. I went with the president, 25th anniversary up to Belfast, and have worked closely with Number 10 and the Prime Minister on the Windsor Framework. And once again, to compliment them on that, that was a very hard deal that they did really, really well. And I'm still working with them on Stormont. We'll see what happens there.
I have one final question, quickly, one each of you. What do you most miss about the UK when you're here, and what do you most miss about the US? Because I always felt Transatlantica was the place to live, right? English tea, American directness. What do you miss quickly?
You want me to go first?
Yes, you go first.
I miss my family, particularly my daughter, who is back in New York, and my twin brother. I miss my friends, like you and all of our mutual friends in New York, and I miss New York pizza.
Okay. So it's pizza from the US, UK.
I miss my children.
Yeah.
But I love America.
Yeah. Okay. Very diplomatic reply. All right. So, thank you very much indeed, ladies.
Thank you.
Really good.
Thank you. It was fun, right? It was really good. Great
Pizza.
to see you.